Aloha, children of the night, and welcome to the Tiki Goth Club. Today we have a book review for you. I don't think I've ever done a book review on any of the videos that I've done.
For my winter vacation, I read a book. It was about goths, and I learned that goths are people too. Thank you.
Yeah, that's it. So actually, Stephen, for Christmas, got me this book, Goth, A History. But it's written by the drummer from The Cure.
The original drummer.
The original drummer. The drummer who was with them for like the first couple albums, actually. All the way up into the 80s.
Yeah, till about 88, late 80s.
Yeah.
And I think he switched to keyboards at one point.
Yes.
But certainly the first 4 albums of The Cure,
yeah,
he was the drummer, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because it's called, A History. But it is kind of like his history with God.
In fact, it was interesting because I bought you the book as a gift, but I hadn't read it.
Yeah.
And you suggested I read it, and I wish he had called it Goth: A Personal History.
Yeah.
Because I was expecting a more comprehensive, like, this is what goth culture is in the 80s, 90s, and the aughts, and this is goth music, and it does hit on all of those. And,
yeah, he hits all the basics.
Writes it, yeah. But it's more his and the Cure's, especially, involvement and his interrelationship with the people.
Yeah.
So it's almost like which I haven't read, but he wrote an autobiography about his time with The Cure called Cured.
Yeah.
And this is sort of like, I almost consider this a sequel, like my personal history with goth.
Yeah.
And it's great at that level. But I went in thinking it would be a comprehensive history of goth. And so if you adjust your expectations. The other thing that was really interesting was you listened to the audiobook.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So Stephen buys me the book, and I started to read it, and I'm like, I wonder if there's an audiobook version of this. And there was, and it was like $16. I'm like, $16 to have him actually read it?
Yeah.
Done. So I flew through the whole thing, and I'm glad I did because it's him, and so you kind of get his tone with it.
And the tone of the book, there's a podcast called Broken Records Podcast. Malcolm Gladwell's a producer, but the person, and I forgive me, I forget her name.
Did you read the book?
I read it on a Kindle.
Okay.
And what's interesting was on the Broken Records podcast, where they interview Lowell, if I can be on a first name basis with him, they interview him, and it's a very good interview.
Yeah.
She also listened to it on an audio and said that this book, and I tend to agree because you listen on audio and she listened to it on audio. Again, the Broken Records podcast host for this episode about this book, and they really enjoyed it because, again, it's a personal history and memoir. When I read it, the first 2 or 3 chapters of the first part was a nice idiosyncratic, like, here's what I think goth represents, here's some history of goth, going back to the 1700s, 1800s of Gothic literature and Romanticism, dark Romanticism, etc. And we can talk about that. But a lot of the middle of the book, when you read it, doesn't read as well as it listens. It's a much better audiobook because it's about, okay, and then I met these people, and then here's how I and The Cure, we interrelated with these people. Although what was really fascinating to get in some of the guts of the book, something I because I'm not as knowledgeable about music and music history as you are, was the interrelationship of Susie and the Banshees with not only the Sex Pistols. I mean, she was a groupie, not a groupie but a follower. There was was it Bramby? The area in England, the followers. There was this cult following of Sex Pistols fans, and Susie Sue was one of them. And she's like I guess, kind of the godmother of goth, really. The transition from pop, from
I'd say
punk to goth to new wave. I've always known her as almost new wave because of her hits, but she was really goth. But how The Cure, in their early days, were instrumental.
Yeah.
And there's some great stories, and I don't know if we should, well, not everyone's going to read the book, and for those who do, forgive me for spoiler alert, but when two members of the Susie Sue's band, and I don't know if they were called the Banshees at the time or not, left to go home to back to Scotland, and were left hanging in the lurch, it was members of The Cure who had to pick up the slack because they were the opening band, or one opened for the other. But
Robert Smith played in Susie and the Banshees.
Yeah, which I never knew.
You didn't know that?
No, I did not know that. And
in the book, it actually, it kind of created a little bit of a rift, I guess.
Yeah.
At least because I guess there was a little bit of like, well, what's his allegiances to, you know?
Yeah. Or distracted from
the thing that
core of the band.
Well, the thing that I found interesting about his story, or the story of goth, for example, is like, you know, they're kind of like, you know, like you talk about Susie Sue and all like that, or Robert Smith or whatever. Like they're creating this music. They're essentially creating this scene. But there wasn't any name for it. You know, it isn't like, let's start a goth band. You know, they kind of created what they created. And then retrospectively, people go back and be like, "Oh, that's goth."
Well, in fact, I think in their first album was Three Imaginary
Boys is definitely not. It's not goth.
No, but they saw themselves as sort of post-punk, post-psychedelic.
Yeah, and it's different. But when you get to the next three albums, though, what Lowell actually concentrates on, with Pornography, Faith, and
17 Seconds.
Yeah, and these are like the quintessential like goth albums for him.
Now, you have to take it a little with a grain of salt, because those were his three, in his mind, peak albums, and they were the three goth albums. But when you look
I'd agree. I mean, Disintegration, is like a masterpiece.
Yeah.
To me, Disintegration's on its own thing, but I would agree with him. Like, those three albums are like what I love about The Cure.
Interesting.
Yeah, especially Faith. I think Faith is my favorite.
I went back and I looked, though, and the problem with the way I listen to music today, and kind of always had, even when I had LPs and then cassettes, is that I listen more to songs than albums, than the conceptual albums. And so even though I went back to those first four albums, fell back in love with the Three Imaginary Boys because of the raw crudeness. Yeah, I wish they didn't. Nowadays, with they're almost extended. There's so many live cuts and cruder. And Boys Don't Cry is still probably my favorite Cure song, which is hard to pick because there's so many great Cure songs.
My favorite Cure song is Primary, followed by A Forest.
And that's the interesting thing. When I went back and listened to the second, third, and fourth albums that he lauds as the quintessential albums, and there's a little bit of, I will have to say, and I don't mean to be overly critical, a little bit of self-congratulatory because I was there and these were the best, and so he wasn't there. Thankfully, as he admits, thank God I wasn't there when Friday I'm in Love with You, my least favorite Cure song,
but I think he was with The Cure like throughout most of the 80s.
Yeah.
But I mean, once you get past Pornography, I mean, The Cure definitely changed their sound.
Yeah, and you're right. And I went back to those.
I don't want to say poppy, but the songs are they're more lighter, they're more whimsical.
Well, there's elements of that in some songs.
You got like Caterpillar, and then you get into like Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me, which is like, you know, like Why Can't I Be You? A very poppy kind of song.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I think
I love the horn version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I think he's right by saying like because people talk about like, you know, it's like, well, is The Cure goth? And it's like, well, it depends on what album.
And his thesis is the second through fourth albums are the quintessential. Yeah. And I went back and the album, and what I really appreciated was particularly A Forest. Which just like, well, I've always loved the song, but when I went back after reading this book and preparing for this, it was like that I forgot how brilliant that is.
Yeah.
The other nice thing about 80s music, because I'm an 80s music guy, so this brought back, and I can wax nostalgic for 30 minutes,
Yeah.
but about when because I'm an 80s kid, and for me it was 91X, XAM, Baja California, Mexico. They had to do that every 30 minutes because they were so 91X was one of the in 1983 one of the first new wave songs after K-Rock in LA, and I lived in San Diego in the 80s, and we couldn't always pull in K-Rock. God, you got to be old to understand what I'm saying. Pull in FM signals on your radio. But 91X went to a new wave alternative DJ format from 83 to 88.
Yeah.
And it was a San Diego-based station, but it was based in Mexico. So the call signal every 30 minutes was XETRA in Spanish.
Yeah.
And this woman's voice, it still rings in my head. From Baja California, Mexico, 91X, and then this DJ comes on, and it was amazing, great stuff if you lived in San Diego, and it powered from Mexico. And then when I moved to LA in the in the 90s, it was K-Rock, and then WHFS, I think I got the call letters right, out of Bethesda, Maryland, was my other, with the Weasel. Oh yeah, the Weasel was great. Which was another, but anyway, so this all brought back memories of all of that, all of those radio stations, formats, and when my influence in that. And the other nice thing was, it was interesting to see how much, when he refers to his influences, how much he was influenced by literature.
Yeah.
And that brought memories for me, because I was a post-punk, pre-grunge guy.
Yep.
I mean, I was saying off camera, we were talking to some folks here, we're filming at Devil's Reef, and how...
we wanted to film here because this is a little bit more gothier than your tiki bar.
Right.
So...
yeah,
trying to be as goth as possible.
Well, plus I have extenuating circumstances at home.
But he mentions the Bell Jar by Sylvia
and that was interesting to me because
depression, like what talks on topics of depression and sadness.
But I actually made a note.
The Doors of Perception. He talks about the Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, which I did read then.
Yeah,
because I read it. I'm like, well, I got to read this.
Isn't that where Jim Morrison came up with the band?
Yeah, the name of the Doors.
Which in turn,
he actually Lowell was influenced by the Doors and Black Sabbath, actually.
And the critic who first used the term goth was in reference to the Doors.
Yeah.
In the late 60s.
Yeah, so there you go. The Doors might be a pre-goth band.
Well, and he sort of makes that case. And
I think he did.
I agree with that.
And then he mentions the Velvet Underground.
Yeah.
Which I think, to me,
and Nico in particular.
Oh, yeah, he's talking about Nico. Not so much with the Nico in the Velvet Underground, but when she went solo.
When she did that album with that kind of pipe organ thing, that conceptual whole thing,
when he was kind of going through his personal influence, I'm like, he was definitely creating a picture that I'm like, I completely get this.
Yeah,
I completely understand.
So
and then he actually, he kind of goes down the list. He starts talking about Bauhaus. He talks about the Damned. A lot of.
And again, a lot of the middle of the book is, and that's why I think it works better as an audiobook, is a lot of my his reminiscence, when I say my, of here's my interface with the band or band members or their music or how it influenced me or I and the Cure influenced them. And it was very kind of like, very much inside. At one point I made a little note in my Kindle that it's a little bit overwhelming as to all the names and so again, it's that's why I wish you'd said a personal history as opposed to a history, because if you come in with that mindset and you listen to the audiobook, I think it's very rich. But the first half and the end there's a lot of concepts, and I don't want to get into all of them in a limited time, but one is for him in particular, a sense of place because he traces like the Clash and the punk movement.
Yeah.
What I found really interesting was he has a lot of really fascinating phrases that are very interesting, and you parse them, and sometimes they hold true and maybe they don't for you, but they're thought-provoking. Like punk for him was extroversion, whereas goth for him was introversion in terms of the lyrics and all.
I can see that.
I can see that. But then I was listening to some of the bands that are goth or post-goth, and so many of them, their lyrics are introversion and more intellectual, although many of the bands are very glam-like or overt or...
Well, he brings up a really, really good point. It was like talking about like a lot of the music in the 70s was very commercial and very surface level. Hey baby, let's rock tonight, kind of shit. And he was saying like when it came to like The Cure and like a lot of the goth bands, it's like that they were singing about, for lack of a better word, darker and deeper topics.
Yeah, although he quotes somebody, which again is another thought-provoking, you may agree or disagree, and I go back and forth on this, was, and I don't know if he came up with the concept or he was quoting it, it's like, at the time, rock songs were about love.
Yeah.
Or they were about death. And goth, they're about love and death. I thought that was a great line. Again, I don't know if it holds true when you listen to the songs with that in mind, but
yeah,
great. And there's a lot of little great lines like that, the extroversion, introversion. And for him, goth is and it is difficult to pin down. It's almost too narrow and too broad at the same time, because what's fascinating for him was this is an inclusive group where outsiders are accepted.
Yeah.
Sort of like, where people can be themselves. And so he loves to tell the story because, and I know he loves it because I've listened to 3 podcasts and he purposely mentions the story each time, whereas the original members of the band were wondering whether to accept induction in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Because of the label of rock and roll. And I think it was Robert Smith was maybe voting against it. And he was saying he was totally for it because for him it was so important that small town people who were ostracized for being intellectual, being different, for being introverted, for being creative, for being whatever, for being gay or for whatever that is, found a home when they either in the big city or in the music of goth. Goth was one of their, for him it was a primary place. For me it was one of the refuges of that, which I found that pretty fascinating. And I was wondering if, because as a Pennsylvania post-industrial child, did that resonate with you or not?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah,
completely. I mean, well, first of all, like as far as them being inducted to the Hall of Fame, well, I really don't give a shit about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's a whole thing's a joke.
No, but he said that people would identify.
But the Cure are a very important band. Though.
Yeah,
and a lot of the key bands of goth are important just musically.
Yeah,
because you are talking about it's just like you talk about like grunge, right?
Yeah,
there's a time before this genre of grunge was, and there is, and it's the same thing with goth. It's sort of like go in the early 70s, you might have had bands that might have like touched on it, but when you get to like the Cure and Bauhaus and Susie Sue, it's like.
But what about the outsider, whether primarily in England but also in America, from the post-industrial, and you identify with the music? Yeah. And you identify with the culture, and it's a safe refuge. I mean, I was wondering if the cultural, not just musical part, resonated with you as well.
Well, here's the thing. It's like being being growing up where I did, which was very small towns, and you think you're an outsider, but you're more of an outsider when you're growing up when it's like everyone is just kind of, for lack of a better word, normal. And then you're not.
Yeah.
And for what for how you see the world, the music you're into, how you dress. And I remember like when I was a teenager in the 80s, it was like when you met someone else that even knew who Bauhaus was, like, you know who Bauhaus is? Oh hell yeah, instant friend. And to me, even like with punk rock, it was like if you met someone like back then who even knew who the Ramones were or the Sex Pistols, you're like, all right, we're gonna be friends forever. Because back then, those people were very, very few and far between, if at all.
And that goes back to England, where the Rolling Stones were met by exchanging blues albums, right? Or
it was funny because I was thinking about of all the bands and all the different alternative, industrial, and goth bands and punk bands for that matter, and I'm like, how the fuck did I get into them? Living in Wilburton number 2, and the thing is I look back and it's like I think about some of the friends that I met and some of the friends that I had, and it's like, oh yeah, he turned me on to The Cure. This guy over here, he turned me on to Kraftwerk and The Cure. This guy here turned me on to all these different bands, and it just so happened I had friends that were kind of a little bit more in the know than me.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, then I'm in the know, you know? Or industrial. I remember being turned on, hey, you should check out Ministry, you should check out Skinny Puppy. Okay, I will.
So that's the thing I really, let me go look at the positives of the book, especially the first third of the book and the end, really I was attracted to because it really brought back a lot of nostalgia for me of that, how I discovered the music. My journey was different because I was a California kid who, although I did identify, and he identifies strongly with place.
Yeah.
That the Thatcherite Reagan era and how disaffected many of us, even us who are a little more conformist or mainstream, were with culture and life at that time, and how that influenced music. Particularly the Clash would be the quintessential point of that. I mean, they are the band because they took on the Brixton and the Notting Hill riots, and if you want to know what we're talking about, the book addresses those pretty well as well, and how the Clash actually took those issues of class head on, but it brought back a lot of nostalgia for me. And I was not a goth. I was a kind of post-punk, pre-grunge was my...
Oh, yeah, I mean...
was where I was from.
Yeah, I mean, for the record, I would not say that I was goth back then. I didn't look the part, of course, but I was I consider myself more of a punk rocker.
Yeah.
And, but I loved that music, though.
But
and that was the thing. I mean, even with my friends, it's sort of that whole stereotypical image wasn't necessarily true, with people that I knew. It's like I knew, there'd be friends that I had that they looked completely normal, but they were punk as fuck.
Well, yeah, but
or
and that's the thing about goth is his definition is also again both narrow and broad at the same time. It's hard to pin down because he's really accepting of the outsider, even if they don't have black eyeshadow to wear all black, the whole regalia, and I didn't wear the regalia, but what I really, and I hope I'm not resorting to stereotyping or overt sexism, but it reminded me, and I even made a note of this while I was reading it on my Kindle. It's like it wasn't that I was goth, but I was attracted like a moth to flame to a certain type of person, particularly a woman. And what's interesting is not a lot of straight men of the 80s were influenced so strongly by the bell jar.
Yeah. No, I don't know of any.
But most of the women who were either friends or who I dated or wanted to date or I wanted to hang out with or did hang out with were. And they were super literate. And then this whole thing brings back memories. Many of them, I even made notes. It was like I just did this stream of consciousness. It's like I just like the primarily long-haired, well-educated women, many of whom were great writers or performers, actors, and they were all voracious readers, usually of fiction. They turned me on to fiction, especially like James Joyce. Many of them played the Smiths incessantly. Many were into The Cure. They all seemed weaned on the bell jar in high school or early college.
Yep.
Often they were painfully introverted or extroverted or both in the same person.
Yes.
And, they appreciated and obsessed over their favorite bands like we, this is binary, but when I say we, but many people. And it was usually Morrissey and the Smiths,
Yep.
The Cure, and occasionally the Talking Heads or Psychedelic for Bauhaus.
Yeah.
And many of them, they also had, because I'm a guy, this is not that people care, but it's just important to me, is the sense of place is so important to me. And whether they, how could grunge come of anywhere else out of the Pacific Northwest? Maybe, but could punk and goth come anywhere out of England? Maybe, but maybe not in the time and place originally. And many people a sense of place.
The interesting thing is, like, he actually talks about that in the book. Essentially, it's like the goth bands that were from America were almost like considered death rock. Mm-hmm. That's when you get into like Christian Death and the bands from here. But it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, though. And it's funny. Well, it's interesting to like put labels on everything anyway. It's like, do you really need to? And it comes back down to the same thing. Like when we talk about tiki, it's like, is this tiki? Is this bar tiki? Is this tiki? Is that tiki? And to me, it's just, as I'm gone on, it's like it's here. It's in your heart.
Yeah, no, and I agree.
To me, like the inanimate objects are not tiki. It's the people.
And I agree.
And that's how I feel about goth. It's like, it isn't. You could, sure, it can be. So you could look at it as a surface level thing, but like, to me, it's here. It's what you think and feel.
And I think he would agree with that. I mean, it'd be fascinating. Not that he would listen to this video, but if he does,
yeah, Lowell, if you stumble upon this video, great job. I kind of like the title of it, a history, because what I realize is like it isn't just like a history of goth, but it's like a history of all of us, in this scene.
Well, and again, he's very inclusive.
Because it's just sort of like, this isn't the history of goth, but it's sort of like my history. You're talking about being nostalgia, and you read. I read that book, and you're like, oh yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like almost my evolution, sort of, in a way.
Yeah, and for me it was the people I were with, or enclaves.
Yeah.
And it's the outsider, the inclusive outsider community, and what it is.
Yeah.
But again, it's something I would listen to on the podcast or listen to the audiobook. Is the best way to appreciate this particular, because again, I wish he had said a personal history.
Yeah.
Because if you go into it with that mindset, it's right there.
So Lowell, if you're watching this video, my buddy Steven here wishes that you wouldn't have called it a history. He's saying that you should have called it a personal history.
Thanks. Now he'll never. He'll be on your show. He just won't want me on it.
The Tiki Goth Club is way more than just this YouTube program. It's also a club that you can join. For $15, you can become a member of the Tiki Goth Club. You get your own membership card with your own number. I'll send you a couple stickers and a pin. I also have shirts for sale, patches, and glasses. If you're interested in any of this, head over to my website, tikigothclub.com, and everything's there.